Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week,
I got to such a crunch point, it was a decision to either do something about it or I probably wouldn't be here, kind of thing.
At no point in life are we rewarded for feeling contentment, or at no point in the rat race is achieving your contentment the ultimate reward.
And just living each day with no agenda other than what's for tea, are we going for a walk, just allowed everything to settle. So it was a bit like mud settling in a jam jar.
and I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday.
The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. Welcome to Mental Health Monday. Again, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for checking us out, for your streams and for your downloads. Thanks as well for your feedback to the Baton of Hope conversations that we were having as part of the last episode of the programme. Really hit home with so many people, that particular project and the work that's going on around it. We'll have some more on that as we move closer to the Baton of Hope tour, which is happening right across the country. So thanks for your feedback for that one, for all your connections on social media as well. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. If you want to get involved, by the way, in the programme, you can find my email address in the podcast notes. Just look at the description for the podcast. You can get in contact with me. You can also find me on social media at Mr. Mick Coyle. MickCoyle. That's on Twitter and on Instagram. You can also join the Mental Health Monday Facebook group. But so many people reached out after the last episode that it was good to hear from you. Now, this week's episode is a really interesting one with a great guy called Gareth Dauncey. Now, Gareth is based in Wales. We're going to talk about his mental health story and also an app that he has created, which allows you to be maybe a little bit more self-aware about some of the issues that you're dealing with. We've spoken many times on the programme before about understanding how you feel, checking in with yourself and thinking, right, what's going on here? Well, Gareth's story actually brings that to life absolutely brilliantly, using felt tip pens and a calendar, and then, as we'll hear from Mood, this new app where you can essentially chart your own sense of well-being and then use that knowledge to then look at your life and think, right, what are those things in my life which are making me feel anxious? What are those days that I'm really struggling with? What can I do then with that knowledge to change those days so I can feel a little bit different, to really come up with a visual representation, if you like, of how you're feeling, to empower you to then take steps to do the right thing for you and, of course, on your terms. Now, Gareth's going to talk on the programme about his experience and his mental health struggles that he went through for many, many decades. But as we'll hear right at the start of the conversation, it was actually the lockdown periods and the pandemic that he actually got a little bit more momentum to actually make changes and do something to change the way he'd been feeling for quite some time.
When the pandemic came along, that was probably the door opening to me finally being able to get well. And by get well, I mean I've probably I don't use the word suffer anymore. Lived with depression off and on for, 35 years, something like that. But it was never so extreme. It would always be deep, but it wouldn't last for such a long period that it forced me to do something about it. And then prior to the pandemic, I just kept sleepwalking, thinking I had wide enough shoulders into a deeper and deeper and longer depression. It's irrelevant, really, what the sort of things were which helped promote that, but I didn't do anything about it. And I got to such a crunch point that it was a decision to either do something about it or I probably wouldn't be here, kind of thing. And in realising that, I then, as the next step, realised there's no help available whatsoever, like zero help. And also I was very, very sort of paranoid about people finding out about it. So the tricky thing was just before the pandemic, I joined a mind group that was 30 miles away. Didn't give them my full name. And I met with about 4 or 5 other people once a week. And that helped a little bit, because you felt slightly less alone in that moment with people who understood, because they felt exactly the same as you, whatever the reasons were. And then when the pandemic came, the sort of pressure that I'd allowed to build up just got relieved overnight. And that's because I'm lucky enough to live in the middle of nowhere. So the pressures that the pandemic brought for other people, I was very lucky to avoid. And being self-employed, I didn't know how I would make a living, but that was still outweighed by the relief of everything just being lifted. And one of the weirdest things of all was I dug up part of our lawn to extend my vegetable patch because I didn't know if I'd be able to get potatoes anymore. And in putting a spade in the ground, I realised, oh my God, because I'd spent 5 or 6 years trying to do up a church, not because I wanted a church, but because it came with a field. And I wanted to take responsibility for fuel and food. And as I put the spade in the ground, it was like an absolute slap in the face where I realised I didn't need a field. I just had to dig up the lawn I already had. And that was the sort of beginning then of trying to make changes in my life. And I'd already started, for no real objective reason, to record each day with a colour pen on a calendar how I was feeling. And when the pandemic came along and I started to dig up the lawn, I saw these colours kind of change and the patterns sort of change. And then I'd always wanted to join Frazzled Cafe, but I didn't live anywhere near a Marks and Spencer. So that went online and I joined the group that Ruby hosted. And I was literally the only sort of fella there. And there was 100 ladies there. And it was very daunting at first. But when I started to talk about these things, I could see other people nodding. And it turned out we all had a very similar experience of pressure being lifted overnight. And I just kept going to that. And even though I wasn't well at that point, I could see in these patterns that I was starting to improve.
I think it's really interesting that the pandemic, which, love it or hate it, will be a moment that people sort of will think pre and post pandemic. You know, that's already happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
I get a sense from you that the lockdown and the pandemic and how it sort of affected was a bit of a shock to the system. The reason I say that is that if the pandemic hadn't have happened, from what you've said there, suggesting that you'd have just carried on with things getting slightly worse. And actually it was the pandemic which was the jolt, which just maybe allowed you to see it from a slightly different perspective.
Well, no, I'd reached a crunch point probably 2 years before that.
Right.
But I was making such slow progress. I'd made all these changes in life, but was seeing no progress. But when the pandemic came along, it was like somebody kicking a door wide open in terms of the relief it provided, because everything just stopped. So everything just stopping, work included, and being in close proximity with family and just living each day with no agenda other than what's for tea, have I got a lettuce, are we going for a walk, just allowed everything to settle. So it was a bit like mud settling in a jam jar. So it provided clarity that I didn't have before, even though... So it was like where I was going anyway, but it gave it like a rocket boost.
So was it work-related stress and sort of just life, professional life, if you like, that had sort of that you could feel it was taking you down a path?
I'm a very I think too much about everything, and in doing that, when I was younger, you can make yourself feel guilty about all sorts of things which are not actually your doing. And they could be global, they could be local, they could be anything. And you just try your best to be a decent person and do the right thing in any given situation. But for a long time, like decades, I was feeling like I was wearing this kind of rucksack filled with guilt. And not being able to do anything to help other people at scale sort of added to that. So in one sense, getting as low as I did was actually a good thing, because it gave me the perspective, and having found a way to dig myself out, which was learning that becoming self-aware is the foundation to everything, actually gave me something to be able to create the simplest tool possible to help other people perhaps do the same thing if they wanted to. So I just wanted to empower people. It's not that I'm trying to do the work for them. It's just that it's very hard to do the work if you don't know where to start and you haven't got something to help you do it.
I think that self-awareness is absolutely huge, and an issue which, why would you be? I often think, why would you be self-aware? Like, why would you be self-aware when we've never been taught how to be self-aware, to read signs, to spot different things? I think it's really interesting. Can I ask you about the guilt thing though? What sort of things would play on your mind? Would they be like obsessive type thoughts?
Oh no, it's proper stuff. Like, we're basically living at the expense of future generations. We're living at the expense of other people around the world. We live in such a privileged fashion that very small problems we amplify when we don't actually know what real problems are. I'm from the valleys. I saw no end of people, as industry stopped, become living in such unhealthy ways that you'd have a sort of 20-year difference in lifespan just between 15 miles. It's absolutely bonkers. And all these things I felt completely impotent to do anything about. So that's part of the reason I wanted to take responsibility in terms of food and fuel. But I can see now that was actually just kind of clutching at straws. And all you can really do is sort of live as an example, but in a way that's not making yourself ill. And actually, if you can do that, that's a pretty good example to set.
Let's talk about sort of the color coding system that you hinted at there. I think often when you can create something visual, it helps people understand, and to put something on paper, it becomes real because it's there on a piece of paper rather than just thinking. The conversation I have with my kids around the table is, what are your marks out of 10 today? That's our sort of measure, and then it becomes it's a 5 today because I didn't do well in my spelling test or whatever it is. They're 5 and they're 8, so it's low level stuff, but it's me trying to instill that self-awareness thing, trying to teach it because nobody taught it to me. But you've obviously taught it yourself and used this color coding system. Just so you obviously, as an architect, have got a great range of pens, I'm sure. But just tell us about how those.
It's very strange. It's a very strange story. None of this makes sense until you look back and it all joins up. So it was Christmas 2019, I think, and I was in WH Smith in town. So none of this was a conscious thing at all. And I saw a calendar, and a set of highlighter pens were on special offer, and I bought them, and I had no idea why, and they just sat on my desk for a week or two. This was leading up to Christmas, and it was coming up to New Year's Eve, and I sat there and I was feeling awful, and I just thought, I know, I'm going to mark each day. I'll make a range of colours. I'll take them, I'll call them 1 to 7, whatever it was, and I'll mark each day how I felt. And there was no sort of conscious decision to do that. There was no big theory to it. It was just like I bought them and I didn't know why. And I hadn't seen this before either. This is the weird thing. I'd not really heard anything about tracking moods But then recently I found some of the sort of stuff I did in mind, and they had this thing on there which we did do it, and I've got no recollection of it whatsoever, which is really odd. There's nothing to do with colour. It was just marking yourself out of 10, like you just said. But when I started to do it, I could see these pinch points, and I thought, there's something in this. And I just did it more and more. And as time went on, I used to make notes, and that became too burdensome. So what I realised was, if I was going to design something, it had to be for me at my worst. And at your worst, you can't get out of bed. So therefore, you've probably heard of tiny habits and all, behaviour and theory and all that. So if your motivation is 0, the ability has to be off the scale in terms of how easy it is to do, which is why I was absolutely clear in my mind that a notification coming up rather than opening an app is what's needed, and 1 tap a day. And that's it goes away. And anything more than that, and I don't think you'll create the habit. And the thing with creating the habit then is you become more and more invested in it. You might never see that picture for a long time, but you can open the app and see it. But the thing is, there's no perspective. So even being self-aware in the moment is very different to having a view looking back of weeks and months and years. So if you think of, this is the analogy I always kept coming back to. And before I did any of this, actually, it was going to be a piece of art called This Is Me, like a big coloured barcode. And if you think of a painting like that and it's touching your nose, you can only see brushstrokes. And it's not until you step back that you can start to see the picture. And then when you really step back, you see it in context. And that sense of perspective was really, really important. And that combined with the habit and privacy is what informed the app, really.
What was that first moment where you realised the value in what you'd done?
When I saw how bad Mondays were. And then I made this decision, right, okay, I won't put any meetings or anything in on a Monday, and I'll try to keep Monday as a kind of flexible day that I'll see how I feel on a Monday. And what I noticed then was that the weekends got better. And then those small incremental steps, each one you take and each one you learn from, just adds to that solid foundation. And the more you do that, the more aware you become about how to live in a way that can suit you. Now, I'm talking about it as if it's easy for everybody. I know it's not, because I'm self-employed, and that makes that side of things easy, but it also brings with it a hell of a lot of stress. Like, where's the next job? You're working 7 days a week, all night, you know, all this kind of thing. But I think no matter what your circumstances, if you can find patterns and then start to understand them, and then start to make little small incremental changes, hopefully you see those patterns improve. And if you can do that, you start to realize that things are not as bad and deep as they are when you look back and you see that improvement. And also that can add to then not catastrophizing the future so much. Now, I'm talking about all these things as if I know what I'm on about. I don't. All I've done really is read an awful lot, apply all this to myself over years, and can articulate what I've learned along the way.
But I would say this to you, Gareth. What does the world tell you about Mondays? That it's the worst day of the week, that you struggle on through it, that actually as a society, we've learned, like, and I'm not blaming Garfield here, but Garfield didn't like Mondays either. But like, we have learned as a society, you were almost taught and conditioned to think that Monday is the worst day of the week, regardless of what actually happens on a Monday. And actually, what's really interesting is becoming the self-awareness of going, I really don't like Mondays because I don't like Mondays, as opposed to I've been told I don't like Mondays, allows you to then go, okay, well, what can I do that's different on a Monday that then means that I don't have to think about a day with such negative connotations? The moment you do that, you've empowered yourself to reroute all of those preconditions that you placed on a day of the week. But it comes from that place of stepping back from it and going, right, well, what's not working for me on the Monday, and how can I change that? And you can change that by recognizing that there's an issue and that you can move things around. I think it's a great example about how this whole mental health world actually involves a reformatting of how we feel about things.
And a lot of work, because the one thing I didn't mention is I went to the doctor and I asked him off the record, because I was so paranoid, see, about not, people not thinking I'm a safe pair of hands with work. And this is nothing against the medical profession at all, because I understand that there's no time. But instantly you're told there's a serotonin problem and have this tablet. And I was convinced that actually the problem is not that. It's that we live in a way which isn't really conducive to being content or feeling joy, not dependent on external things. And we're all so busy, and so we're almost at a constant stress level where it just takes a little bit more and it tips you over the edge. And this kind of society's kind of set up like that. And I was convinced that there's actually a different way to live, but I just didn't know what that looked like. And this tool enabled me to find these pinch points. And the more these pinch points that you find, it's like ironing out creases in a sheet. I'm only just thinking of this analogy now, right? But eventually you end up with a pretty flat sheet. And that's kind of where I am now. And that's taken, it sounds crazy now, but it's probably taken 5 years. I mean, 5 years is a hell of a long time, right? But I've never felt like this my entire life. And ever.
But that's 5 years that you've invested in yourself, isn't it? You've invested that 5 years in actually your future.
Completely, because now I'm actually optimistic about the future. I've never felt like that ever. And each day I get up, I can't wait actually to get up now and just get on with the day. And that is a very unusual thing for me, and it seems to be sticking.
I was going to say, when we talk about preconditioning as well, I think it's really interesting that when you can think about the world from a what's in it for me, that contentment that you're looking for, at no point in life are we rewarded for feeling contentment, or at no point in the sort of in the rat race is achieving your contentment, the ultimate reward. It's getting the job done, or it's financially. And actually reprioritizing your contentment at the expense of the things that you are told are the things that you should prioritize is a very big shift, because that goes into that whole reprogramming about what we are told our role is. And our role is to get up in the morning and go to work and earn a living, and then, you know, make sure the kids are doing this and then bring them up right. And, vote in an election and have a street party to celebrate the royal family. Like those sorts of, almost those expectations that we place on ourselves. And we never place an expectation of how are you going to achieve contentment? How is your wellness going to be the thing that you're going to measure?
Well, I think the problem is you told a lie, which is that that basically a sense of feeling content is contingent on achieving those external things, as opposed to learning that it comes from within, really. And the thing with all those things, they're completely goal-orientated. And once you reach one of those goals, what usually happens is okay, what's the next thing? And it just goes on and on and on. So I really like the idea of just being a tortoise, or even a snail, as opposed to a hare racing around, and just enjoying the moment. Now, that's one of the biggest things I've learned, is not to project into the future and not to sort of rule the past, and to literally try and enjoy the moment. And that is the hardest thing of all for me, because I can't stop thinking. But what's really happened in the last 2 years, 3 years of practicing all this stuff is that I've managed to create a little bit of distance between thoughts. And then when you can do that, you realize you're not your thoughts, and there is this other sort of awareness. And that has been absolutely key as well, I would say. But this stuff isn't hard, and really it's what we should be learning as little duts in school.
So I'm trying to teach my kids now. So you mentioned the veg plot, because I'm teaching my kids now, and I don't know about you, but I find, as an overthinker myself, that actually doing gardening is a good time to think. It's a great time to think both about stuff that's happened. I think as much as anything, rather than ruin decisions are made, it almost gives a chance to refragment the brain around some decisions you've got to make. Yeah, I think it does that. But I think what it also does is, and I think when we talk about the future and thinking about the future from a positive point of view, and I've said this before in the podcast, so forgive me for anyone who thinks, here we go again, he's banging on about his garden. It places you, when you plant a plant, it places you 3 months down the line. It places you 6 months down the line. It places you a year down the line of thinking, right, I'm going to put this here. Where will I be in 2 weeks? Will it grow? Will it have germinated? Will I get something from it in 2 weeks' time? Will I get something from it in a month? So you are placing yourself in the future, but what you're doing, you're almost setting a marker for the future with an expectation that something might be happening. But actually, then if it doesn't happen, it allows you to then reverse engineer it and go, right, well, why didn't it happen? I didn't water it. I went on holiday for 2 weeks and I left. So actually, you can have I would say it's almost like a safe space for investing in the future, and invested in a small part of the universe that you can control, that you can then learn from. And even if it all goes horribly wrong, there's no danger or risk to you.
The garden is the best, and I spend all my time if I'm not in the garden, I'm in the sea, and if I'm not working. And the garden for me is an absolute metaphor for the mind. Everything you do to obtain a healthy garden, whether it's watering, weeding, feeding, all of that is a superb metaphor for the brain. But also, it's a barometer for how well I'm doing. So our garden looks particularly good at the moment. All the veg is blooming, and it really is a barometer. So if the garden's not doing well, I know I'm not doing well. And if I see my mood change slightly for a few days, I spend more time in the garden, because it's the antidote. And I agree with everything you've just said. And one of the bigger ideas I've had, I'd love to do something called matter, which is to do with the grey matter and the matter in the ground, and the fact that nothing much more matters than those two things. Because if we run out of harvests, we've had it. And if we're not all well mentally, we've had it. And I know it's been done before, with it being a therapy, really. But there's so much there. You think of parkrun, for instance, and how that relates to loneliness. So there's so many ways this idea of matter could work.
Yeah.
But what I don't want to do is be the guy that becomes ill doing it.
Yeah, I read that the actually the physical act of touching soil sends the hormonal sort of shift in the brain. Just the act of doing it. So you don't have to know anything about it, but that thing, but then there's also that thing of you symbolically put yourself in the earth, away from the social media world and expectations, that you put yourself in the earth. I think that's a huge grounding. It sounds cheesy, I'm saying that.
It's humbling, and you feel part of a much bigger whole, because you're actually, as you were talking about, investing yourself into seeds and things like that. You become part of that cycle completely.
Yeah, absolutely. We mentioned the calendar before, and the different colours. The Mood app, and the link for this is in the podcast notes for the episode. There's a tech version of this now, so people can download this and actually play along with your calendar, but actually do that for themselves. That's something people can do from the App Store. Is that right?
It is, but they won't find it on the App Store. The only way to find it, and that's part of the problem, I need to find a way to amplify my voice about it, really. But it's the website is Mood App, so at moodapp.io, and the links are on to the Play Stores are in there. And what I was thinking is, if I set up a little code or something, say Mood 30, it would give people a chance to try it for a month. But maybe we could have a chat about that later. And then there's the podcast I've started as well, called How Do You Feel Today? So basically the app just asks you a non-leading question: how do you feel today? You tap one of 5 sort of shades of a pre-chosen colour, but you can change that colour, and you set a timer for it to come up and ask you that question. And it's just the lighter the mood, the lighter the shade. It's as simple as that. And it just stacks each day's on the next one, and then you can scroll through it at different scales. And it's just a way to become self-aware. But it's so important, because I see all these things where people are trying to do things to feel better, but there's actually no barometer of how they are in the first place.
Well, I quite like that it's almost like a starting point, isn't it? And actually, that idea that you had those conversations on top of it is that almost that next level. But that thing of it, you could then go back. I know I'm big into thinking, right? Oh, I feel a bit down today. Well, what is it? Did you have, did you sleep enough last night? Have you been for a run recently? Have you been in the garden? When did you last sit down with the ukulele? Have you spent some time with the kid? You can kind of go, oh, actually, I've not done any of those things. That's why I feel, and I presume people can look back and go, I was in a really good place then. What was going on? And it might be, oh, that was the time I was doing this.
And without becoming too obsessed about the minutiae of it. And that's the whole thing about become self-aware. Over a long period, you get to know yourself better. So each time you make an entry, it's almost, I set mine for sort of 6, but it doesn't have to be then. But you can reflect on the day. So it's a moment of mindfulness for that day and that moment. And that becomes a practice in its own right. And the more you do that, the more you understand yourself, the more you know when to step in, the better the picture builds, the more you can see where changes need to be made. And that's why it's taken so long, I think, for me to become well. Because, and when I say well, I don't mean well in relation to being chronically depressed. I just mean in relation to the rest of my life. I've genuinely never been so well. But I would never have been able to make those changes if I hadn't had the perspective that came from doing this practice for 3 years now.
Absolutely. Gareth, we will get the link to the Mood App in the podcast notes, so people can go and check that out, find out some more links as well to the podcast as well that people can check out too. Thank you so much for your time today. I feel like we could have talked for so much longer, mainly about gardening, to be honest. But thank you for joining us on Mental Health Monday. It's been a real pleasure.
I know that this sort of practice can help one person, and all I want to do is empower people. But this is why I talk about the tortoise rather than a hare, because there's no massive marketing budget, there's no big anything to this, right? But I'm absolutely convinced that if you can help enough one person at a time, you will make a difference in society. And the other thing is, by taking away words, it means that people can ask for help by showing their picture to somebody. Sometimes people can't articulate these things. But also, I try to make the pictures beautiful so that people can become proud of their moods and how they feel. And if that happens, they may share them. So you can see this T-shirt here. This is me in July. And you can see, I could explain all of that to you. But if people share, and I wore that to the pub actually, and a chap asked me about it, and then he opened up about his girlfriend. And if people share how they feel, I'm convinced that that stigma I talked about, which really stopped me from getting well sooner, can get chipped away, one person at a time.
Gareth, thank you so much for your time. Speak soon.
No, it's lovely. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.